I just finished watching what I think is probably one of the best rock documentaries that I've seen in a long time. And I'm talking about Becoming Led Zeppelin. This movie was really good. But before I dive into this movie, what I liked about it, how good it was, and what happens next after watching this documentary, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you've ever been interested in learning more about the band Led Zeppelin, Becoming Led Zeppelin is a really good place to start. There's tons of literature out there. There's probably a couple of documentaries out there. I can think of one off the top of my head that really focuses mostly on Jimmy Page, and that is It Might Get Loud, which I've also done a video on before too, which you can find up here. But back to Becoming Led Zeppelin. The reason I think this documentary does such a good job in telling the story of Led Zeppelin comes down to two main reasons. One, we have interviews with everybody in Led Zeppelin, and they did these interviews specifically with each member to make this documentary. So they're talking about what's happening on the screen as it's happening, giving you that perspective. And they've even uncovered and used audio interviews of John Bonham, so you get his perspective from time to time about what's happening or what happened in the past. And two, they do a really good job of focusing in on the origins of the band members. I feel like we really kind of just start documentaries around the time when the band forms, but a good solid 45 minutes of this documentary is really just learning who these people are as they grew up and as they got into music. For example, we learn a lot about Jimmy Page, how he's a studio musician, John Paul Jones, their bass player, how his parents were really into music and encouraged him, and they were also studio musicians, and how Robert Plant and John Bonham became friends, did a couple of bands together, and then wound up kind of being in Led Zeppelin. But that's just a short version of how this band kind of forms together. But there are a couple other aspects this documentary highlights about the band Led Zeppelin that I want to talk about. One of those aspects is the encouragement that almost every band member got from people in their circle or from each other. In this documentary, we learned that Jimmy Page's father didn't really know if he was going to do well in music, but still encouraged him to do it. John Paul Jones had encouragement multiple times from his family member, from his church, and ultimately his wife is the one that got him into Led Zeppelin by calling up Jimmy Page and saying, "I heard you're putting together a band." John Bonham's wife doesn't really like the idea that he's doing music with Robert Plant. She thinks Robert Plant is bad news, but she ultimately does allow him to do music with Robert Plant. And later on, Robert Plant's wife does convince John Bonham's wife to let them go on tour and do music together. When they first start playing music together, within the first 5-10 minutes of them practicing, they know there's a connection and they know they have something really special together. And that's something that I think most great bands kind of have. But they don't really get that just in that moment. It's all the years of practice that they've had beforehand. All the studio sessions that John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page sat in and did really helped them expand their knowledge of music and help them have a lot of influences to pull from. It also gave Jimmy Page a lot of knowledge about how studios work and how to record. Robert Plant and John Bonham had all played in several different bands and were all very comfortable with what they were doing. Even though at times they say they weren't, I think they were able to rely on each other to help them find their voice and find the skills that they probably had all along in making Led Zeppelin great. There's a specific part a little bit closer to the end of the documentary where Jimmy Page says it really well, where he says he wants everyone's voice in Led Zeppelin to be heard when it comes to the recording process. And what he means is he wants everyone's instrument to be heard. And I think this is very easy for this band to do because each member respects each other so well. John Paul Jones says multiple times in the documentary he just loves how John Bonham played drums and how sometimes he would leave a note out here or there so that John Bonham's kick could come in a lot louder and have more of a presence. And even Jimmy Page was focused on making sure that John Bonham's drums had some sort of sonic signature when it came to Led Zeppelin. A couple other aspects that I do want to note about this movie that they do a really good job of highlighting is that, first, nobody in the UK really believed in Led Zeppelin. They got almost all their fans in America first, and then a year later they came back to the UK and did a massive show. Even Rolling Stone and other news outlets didn't really give Led Zeppelin good press, but they knew that Led Zeppelin was starting to sell out shows and was growing big in the underground. And so a year later, after touring pretty relentlessly in the US, when they come back to London, the UK, they are welcomed with pretty open arms and people love them. But in their hometown, in their home country, no one loved them really. So if where you are as a musician isn't giving you the love you need, maybe you need to go elsewhere and find your audience elsewhere. I think that's a solid lesson to take from this movie. Two, another lesson that Jimmy Page has had a long standing on is that Led Zeppelin was never going to do any singles. He saw so many musicians and so many bands before him get burned out on doing singles. It's crazy to think that over 60 years ago, people were chasing the algorithm of the day with radio by making singles. And Jimmy Page said, we're just going to do albums. And he specifically wrote and mixed the songs in a way to where you couldn't pull a single out. It had to be played all the way through, which is just genius on his part. Because in this process, he preserves the band's not only integrity, but like their sonic signature, and it kind of keeps the band from doing burnout. Because they don't have to worry about writing a hit song after a hit song. They just have to write songs they like and then say, here's an album, and that's it. So I think the idea of not doing singles, not worrying about chasing the radio or the algorithm is a lesson that still holds true for us today. And lastly, it's always said that Led Zeppelin kind of stole their music from other people at times, but in this documentary, they actually do a really good job of saying who their influences were, or if they did kind of lift a lyric or a part or had some inspiration from another song. They do a really good job of mentioning the source material that they were influenced by. And I think this is a really good way that Led Zeppelin has maybe like turned a page or kind of tried to take control of the narrative, because they've been accused for a long time of stealing certain songs, but of course this seems to just happen because they're really big. Artists that are really big kind of just get accused of this because people want a piece of their pie. But in this documentary, like I said, they do such a good job of just saying, oh, I was influenced by this blues singer, I used this lyric in our song, or I heard this one technique happen in this other song and I used it in our song. So it doesn't really feel like they're lifting or they're stealing, but more so just saying we had a wide variety of inspirations that helped us create music. And the way they approach this conversation, I think, is very respectful of the musicians that inspired them, but also paying some respect to people that might also be inspired by their music as well too. Now, these are just a couple of lessons that I took from this documentary. Overall, this documentary takes us from when all the members in the band were first getting into music to the point when Led Zeppelin 2 was being released. There's, of course, many more albums that Led Zeppelin has released, and the story doesn't stop here. Of course, this documentary is called Becoming Led Zeppelin, and so it's only really covering the first chapter of their lives. If you want to find out more about Led Zeppelin and what they were all about, I would recommend picking up the book Hammer of the Gods. This is a book about Led Zeppelin that is kind of told as a narrative, taking you, of course, from the very beginning all the way up to the band pretty much dismantling and having a couple of other reunion shows here and there. It's a really good book, and I can't recommend it enough if you want to learn more about Led Zeppelin. And lastly, I know this is a documentary, but I can't help but compare this movie to Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, Bohemian Rhapsody was a biopic, and this is definitely a rock documentary. But there are aspects of how music was used, how concert footage was used, that seem very similar in vibe. And while I feel like Bohemian Rhapsody was trying to create their own music videos inside of the movie, we're using actual footage of Led Zeppelin and playing a song on top of it for probably about 2 to 3 minutes. And they do this for several songs throughout the documentary, making it close to 2 hours long. But at the end of it, even though we don't get the full story of Led Zeppelin, and we just get kind of a solid introduction to the members in the band and the start of their career, I still feel pretty satisfied with how this turned out and how this movie just is as its own. So I wish directors, if they're making a rock documentary or they're making a biopic, if they could watch both and kind of learn lessons on how to keep an audience engage, how to share facts, but also just to kind of like tell a good story. Because even though we're really relying on interviews that were specifically done for this documentary, I still feel like a solid story was told. And not just through a biopic of like actors reenacting the story. I feel like I was along on the journey with the members of Led Zeppelin as they're telling the story. But what do you guys think? Have you seen Becoming Led Zeppelin? And have you seen Bohemian Rhapsody? Do you think one of these styles is better than the other? And do you like the way that both or either of these bands were portrayed in their own respective movies? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.